one caveat that John and I have discussed is that we're really not trying to debate the Israel-Palestine issue here, but to explain how Russell's views about it developed. And in fact, we sent off the first version of this expanded article even before the events of October 7th, 2023. Um, we have a nice framing device in that in his biography in the 70s of Russell, Ronald Clark really excoriates Russell for what's always referred to as his last political statement, which was sympathetic to the Palestinians and critical of Israel. And Clark implies that this was a break from Russell's previous pro-Israel views, and he calls the statement unexpected and inexplicable. But what we try to show is that this isn't really true, that the statement was in keeping in where he was going on the issue. Clark accuses Russell of faulty
Is that
grammar
John?
and says the statement, quote, condemned the Israelis for doing no more than they were forced to
No,
do
that's
by
not
the
him.
realities of life. Uh,
I'm trying to.
Are you
Thom,
hearing me?
Thom was muted.
Yes. Yes, I just muted it.
You're
Sorry, Thom. I just muted everyone because of the background noise and immediately unmuted you without success.
Well, you just did that a second ago, right?
Yeah. So just backtrack 10 seconds if you feel the need.
Okay. So we were just talking about Clark's criticism of Russell's statement. So the statement was dated January 31st, 1970, and was released on February 3rd, the day after his death. It was read at an international conference in Cairo. And our updated paper, we developed a lot more background on how Russell came to write it. And it's interesting that, well, Giovanni sent this around the other day, but I had noticed, I'd come across this when it came out on February 24th last month, that there's a blog called Blogging Theology, which I've seen on a few subjects. But the guy who does that podcast, he did a whole thing on February 24th on this last statement where he reads the whole statement and he keeps repeating, this could have been written today, which is what I always say about the statement. I'm not going to read big swaths of it, but I'll just give you, encapsulate it. It's 5 paragraphs long. So in the statement, Russell accuses Israel of expanding through force of arms and of using its conquest to improve its negotiating positions. He says Israel's aggression must be stopped because, quote, every expansion is also an experiment to discover how much more aggression the world will tolerate, unquote. He expresses sympathy for the Palestinian refugees, many of whom are now in their third decade, as he mentions, and in temporary settlements, and he refers to the treatment as wanton cruelty. Here's a quote on that. Quote, the tragedy of the people of Palestine is that their country was given in quotes, by a foreign power to another people for the creation of a new state, unquote. He notes that what Israel's doing to the Palestinians can't be defended by the suffering of Jews in Europe at the hands of the Nazis. And finally, he declares that the first step toward a settlement is, quote, an Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in June 1967, unquote. So that's the basics of the statement. So we try to do some stuff on Russell's wider views that might lead him to issue a statement like this. And of course, that goes into his views on nationalism. We expand this in the updated paper because in 2019, we focused mostly on Russell's negative views on nationalism. But he, in fact, had both positive and negative views on nationalism, and they come into play here. This dual view in turn arises from his theory of creative versus possessive human impulses. The former, creative, are directed toward creating what would not otherwise exist, he says, and the latter, meaning the possessive human impulses, are directed toward acquiring or retaining what exists already. And these impulses underlie the behavior of nations. This comes from principles of social reconstruction. So, for Russell, nationalism is negative when it puts nations in competition with one another, and this can lead to war. Most obviously in his feelings about World War One. And nationalism is positive when it fosters the creative development of a people and culture. And it's in this sense that he supported both, in this positive sense, that he supported both Jewish and Arab nationalism. So Russell's changing views on Israel. Um, while at first Russell didn't think creating a Jewish state in Palestine was the answer to the so-called Jewish question, because frankly, Palestine wasn't big enough. That was his view. He eventually became, by 1943, a strong supporter. He was, in fact, a stronger supporter than his friend Einstein was. And as we say, we argue that his support for Jewish nationalism was cultural rather than militaristic or competitive. And we have um, this we can base on a 1963 letter he wrote to a Soviet newspaper that's in Ray Perkins' book. We also note that Russell's support for the creation of Israel was never based on the Bible or tradition or ancestral claims. And he never speaks of the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians in terms of religious conflict. In terms of problems that could result from a Jewish state in Palestine, um, he originally focused on the conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. At the same time, we have several quotes that I think John's going to go into, where he says that he doesn't know enough about the region or the conflict to opine on it. But of course, then he goes on to opine on it. Um, but he eventually does turn his focus to the Palestinians rather than just the Arab states. And the earliest statement we have from him on the Palestinians is from 1946. This is very early in this. And in that statement, he worries about the fight between Jews and Palestinians for the control of Palestine could lead to nuclear war. Um, Although here he uses not the not the word Palestinians, but Mohammedans. And that's from Ideas That Have Helped Mankind, which is it's 46, but it's in Unpopular Essays. Um, But his defense of the Palestinians really gets going in the 60s, and at least from 1963, he begins to focus more on the Palestinians as a minority and the situation as one of colonialism. And interestingly, like he tends not to ever blame the Zionists or the Israelis, but European supported colonialism and later American imperialism, sort of similar to his criticisms at the time of the Vietnam War. In my view, he kind of almost lets the Zionists and the Israelis off the hook too much. And his defense of the Palestinians at this time is in line with, we're arguing, in line with his defense of other minorities throughout the 1960s, including Jews in the Soviet Union and other refugees. In 63, he sent a representative, Ralph Schoenman, to Israel to look into the situation of the Palestine Arab refugees, and he advocated for a Palestinian state in Jordan. Um, he increasingly shows a willingness in the 60s to criticize Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, if mostly in private, including in letters with Nasser of Egypt. Um, then in 68, he sent a message that's similar to his final statement to a conference on human rights in the Middle East, which was held in Beirut, and which he defended the Palestinians, and he defends, quote, the right of all the people of Palestine to their homeland, unquote. So at the same time that he's defending um, the Palestinians, he's obviously become much more aware of the plight of the Palestinians. He becomes more critical of Israel's behavior, but we would say that he's always still a supporter of Israel. But the criticisms do get harsher. So, for example, in a statement on June 12th, 1967, right after the Six-Day War, he criticized as aggression Israel's attack on Syria, which he said was continuing, quote, despite universal demand for ceasefire, unquote. So in a sense, like we're saying that Russell viewed Jews in Israel as a former minority who are now acting as a state power. And, obviously he was often critical of state power. In 1960, he said it was a mistake to create a Jewish state in the Middle East, but it would be a bigger mistake to dismantle it. And I find this interesting because other people have had that position. For example, I remember Christopher Hitchens once saying the same thing in an interview with, I think, Charlie Rose. And he discusses his conflict over this, saying that it probably should have never been created, but that would be a mistake to dismantle it. He discusses that in a 1962 interview published in Hebrew in Tel Aviv, which I think John is going to, that's one of the documents John's going to go into. So anyway, I'm just going to conclude this very quick overview, is that, we can say that Clark was wrong, that the final statement on Israel-Palestine wasn't a departure. It was in keeping with his trajectory of um, having more empathy for the Palestinians and of being more and more critical of Israel's behavior. So over to you, John.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. That was great. Let me put up my handout on the screen. Okay, everybody can see that, I hope. So I emailed it to the list if anybody wants to save a copy. So Tom provided the original inspiration, which was the interesting theme he just talked about. And I made 2 visits to the archives to look at some documents. There are a number of unpublished documents. Russell's piece work from the 60s has hardly been mined by scholars, I think. And the archives were great. We both want to thank them very much because they let us make use of a couple of significant unpublished documents that we're publishing for the first time, and I put those in the handout. So as Tom said, we tried to show Russell's progression over time, but also that he acted out of consistent principles. This is hard to do in politics. So first I thought about the problem of the intellectual in politics, because this goes back to Plato and in fact earlier. How can you be rational and apply this to politics? So what we have is kind of a case study in Russell's political thought. Russell was a realist in politics, namely the line that starts with Thucydides, that all states act out of self-interest. And they all have the same such motives, and that there is no good or bad. It's not a matter of morality. So in this way, he tried to be fair to both Israel and Arab states. But at the same time, he had an idealistic side, even utopian. And we see both sides here. He had idealistic hopes for human progress, for peace and increased creativity. And he supported both Jewish and Arabic culture. And that's what we call good nationalism, as Tom talks about, because some people have taken that another way. But he treated conflicts between states in terms of political realism, that states acted out of possessive impulses. And this was the theory he developed during World War I. Okay, let's see. So let's go to some documents that I organized here in categories. Number 1, first, he always supported Jewish rights and the development of Jewish culture and of any culture and the existence of Israel from 1943. This was earlier than the British government of Attlee supported a Jewish state. So this is number 3, passage 3. he wrote this interesting article that's not well known because it's hard to find, that I cite there, and an Israeli woman reprinted it in her discussion of it that you can find online. Although she claims that Russell believed in Jewish exceptionalism, which we very much disagree with, not with the fact of that, but with the fact that Russell held that belief. What's interesting here is that Russell never talks about a Jewish return to their homeland. He did not connect ancient politics and modern politics. And I find this interesting because I'm an ancient historian and I agree with that. I've worked on that in Greece and with modern Greece in relation to ancient Greece. So what he says here in 3b is that the country is the Arabs' country. Look at this. The actual Palestinian Arabs may be unreconciled to the influx of an alien population into what is, after all, their country. And he talks about it 4 times up until 1970 as a Palestinian homeland. They're the people living there. He wasn't interested in what happened thousands of years ago. And he believed this consistently. And you can also see that he thinks it's an incursion of European colonialism, which he brings out a little more later on. So here we have the problem of nationalism, because Israel becoming a state raises the problem of how states behave. He had a very odd belief about this in number 4, about ancient Jews, which is very peculiar and weird history. But again, he doesn't apply that to modern times. He doesn't look at ancient Jews of the Bible and make any inferences about what Jews are like or what Israel is like today. Because look at number 5. Every nation is a bully at heart. I believe this was during the Suez Crisis in the 50s. And Israel and the Arab states are no different. Look at 6. It is not clear which side is God's and which is the devil's. This was the way he discussed World War I, which is very high-minded. But as it turns out, some people thought that this neutrality or supposed impartiality by Russell, some people thought it was unfair because he should have been favoring Israel more in certain conflicts. So that's something that became debated later. But from about 1948 to 1963, his main concern is peace between Israel and Arab states. He sees this as an impediment to world peace. That is, he's not interested in Palestinians as a minority in relation to Israel. And this is when he claims to not to take sides, but to be above that. This is somewhat unusual. I don't think we think of Russell this way, but look at number 9 and 10. I have not enough knowledge to form an opinion on the complicated question of the relations of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. 10, I do not know enough to express an opinion as to the rights or wrongs in the various matters in dispute. He expresses an agnosticism. And he does this twice in his writings about Greece, which I found odd because Greek leftist politicians were coming to him who had been active leaders of the Greek resistance to the Nazis. And they were asking Russell for support after the war. He said, I don't know enough to take sides, which is a little disingenuous if you're talking about the person leading the resistance to the Nazis, who's, by the way, one of the most heroic figures in all of Greek history, and who admired Russell. So this is a little strange, but this is the way some other intellectuals talk. They don't want to take part in party politics. They want to be bigger than that. He's looking to world peace as a whole. This is the way he sees the issues, in other words, as a border dispute for these decades. So you find Socrates talking this way. I'm above partisan politics. Lord Byron talks this way when he went to Greece. I'm just for the peace of everybody. I don't care about one side or the other. So he thinks this is high-minded rationality. or neutrality, I would have to say, but it's not the way we think of Russell the activist. He has a view from higher up. So then in 12 and 13, we talked about this a little bit. He never blames Israel for the problems that have been created. He blames European colonialism in number 12 for the problems which have arisen in relation to the latest serious attempt to found a new colony, I mean the creation of Israel. This has raised great difficulties. I do not wish to express any view on these controversies. There it is again. When do we know Russell holding back his views? And in 13, again, Thom cited this one. It was a mistake, but, it was a mistake not to support its existence now. And he blames both sides there, intolerance by both Jews and Arabs. Now, okay, number 14, here's one of our new documents that has been unpublished until now in English. Russell gave an interview in Tel Aviv that was published in Hebrew, and the archives hired a rabbi in Canada to translate it. So this is when he says, I favored the creation of Israel. I knew it would bring many problems. He kind of backdates that a bit. I supported it very much, but this created severe problems. Any nationalism is not to my liking. And he means state political nationalism. And he's behind Jewish nationalism, he says. But he blames both sides for animosity. Fanaticism should be reduced on both sides. So he's trying to treat both sides equally, and he certainly defends Israel. So you could say so far he's been diagnosing the problem and not criticizing Israel itself. But in 15, he strongly supported Israel when it came under attack. Are we all to become Eichmanns, and is the state of Israel to be totally destroyed? He wrote this way to Nasser and other Arabic leaders in the 60s. Well, it's from 1963 that we find him concerned with Palestinian refugees as a problem of refugees and of a minority that may be mistreated or ignored. In other words, as a problem within Israel, for Israel, not just Israel in relation to its neighbors as border states. So again, he saw this as a roadblock to peace in the region. The Arab states were mad at Israel because of this. So this led Russell to investigating the situation of the refugees and how Israel would deal with this. He found Israel to be intransigent, although again, he was willing to criticize Arabs as well when he thought it was warranted, but he becomes harder on Israel. Schoenman was even harsher. So 18. Schoenman went over there as Russell's envoy, and he upbraided the Prime Minister Ben-Gurion on the shortcomings of the Israeli government. He was harsh and uncompromising. Russell had to apologize because he wants the Arabs to trust him as well. So, but then Russell starts to be a little more aggressive about supporting the return of Palestinian refugees. Look at 22. The right of the return of the Arab refugees is inviolate, and this is the sine qua non of any peace settlement. Again, he's talking about it as a return to their land they had been displaced from, and he thinks Israel should give on that issue a little bit. So here's something else that we found that's new and not known. In fact, this is unpublished. Israeli leftists started to communicate with Russell. He's got the Peace Foundation from 1963, and that's when this all picks up. As Thom said, it parallels some of his other campaigns, and in fact, sometimes it comes to parallel his campaign against the U.S. in Vietnam, some of the same language. What happened here is that two Israeli authors, Orr and Machover, who were Israeli socialists, wrote a book called The Palestine Problem. You can find this book online. It was published in English, but it was never published with Russell's introduction. They wrote to Russell, and right away, very quickly, turned around in about a month, he sent them an introduction, which is in the archives but never published, and it's not clear why. So let's see. They're more radical than he is. They list a whole agenda of points and demands for Israel to reform. Russell is critical but less radical because he's still playing the peacemaker for both sides. So here's what I put in italics. However legitimate the aspirations of the Jews to a national home, the realization of that desire in a manner which violates the basic rights of other people has created one of the most painful moral dilemmas in our time. So now he's really speaking out. But again, he backs off a little bit. Only a common a common policy for Jews and Arabs based on social advances without discrimination or domination of one by the other. So he's not as harsh as what Orr and Machover say in their book, but he becomes much more critical after the Six-Day War. Now here, I myself don't know the whole history, and I didn't want to get into that. So if Russell's wrong in calling Israel aggressive, fine, I'm sure somebody will argue that. People would argue that Israel was being defensive, but Russell didn't think so. He called Israel the aggressor, and that was the newspaper headline at the time, number 22. It is dishonorable for Western governments to remain silent about Israel's continuing attacks. It seizes what it can and holds on until this becomes the status quo. Those who rightly sympathize with Jewish victims of Hitler's aggression in Europe should not equate Israel's survival with its policy of territorial conquest. Aggression is unjustifiable, the more so when perpetrated by those who know its full meaning. So this becomes a big point for him, which appears in his final statement of 1970. And this was actually in the book by Orr and Machover that he wrote the introduction to, but he didn't pick up this point. He tried to be more moderate. The point is that being the victims of suffering does not justify you to inflict further suffering. Although, if you notice here, do you see the end of this paragraph? He blames America. He manages to blame Americans. So again, he is trying not to blame Israel inherently, but to blame it on a problem created by European and American colonialism and power incursions into the region, you could say. So 23 is like the point that I just made. The fanaticism of the Nazis has, as was inevitable, generated a counter-fanaticism among a certain number of Jews. That's his kind of psychological explanation, which reminds you of some of the ways he talks in his autobiography and some of his other writings. That I started a school, or he sees big kids beating up on little kids, and those little kids are going to become aggressive because they were hit on. This is his psychology of saying that past suffering does not justify future aggression. Okay, so 24, just a couple of more points I'd like to make. And 24 is again him talking about the right of all the people of Palestine to their homeland. 4 times he called it their homeland. In 1943, 1966, 1968, and 1970. 2 of these are during the Schoenman period, but one is before Schoenman and one is after. So you cannot attribute this to Schoenman, although it gets a little more sharp in the language at the time when Schoenman was working with him. But he's pretty consistent about that. That helps explain the final statement, as Thom said. It's not an outlier. So here in 24, by the way, he calls himself a socialist, which is interesting because many scholars manage to deny that. So Russell had the Peace Foundation, and there are a number of documents in the archives of people like Chris Farley, Russell's secretary, who was active in the Peace, might have been the head of the Peace Foundation at this time, I'm not certain. He was taking right in a committee for solidarity with the Palestinian people, a Palestinian Day conference in London. And he says here in 25, our Jewish group wrote to Russell, and Russell said, I'm not going to do it unless you recognize that the rights of Palestinians must also be defended. So he thinks he's being fair and not radical by supporting Palestinians. 26. So here comes to things we talked about already, leading up to his final statement. Arabs were writing to him, leftist Israelis were writing to him as a peacekeeper, deal with this issue to make peace in the region. So we hold that this leads to his final statement, and it's consistent with his principles. Harry Ruja is someone besides Ronald Clark that Thom talked about who blamed Russell. Harry was an old member of the Russell Society and a good friend. He said Russell ended up in the arms of Arafat. This can only refer to the final statement. But we don't agree with that. But what happens here is that some people blamed Russell for supposed neutrality. They took that as disingenuous and unfair. They wanted to see it in terms of good versus evil. In other words, they saw this conflict more along the lines of World War II, or a model like World War II, a fight of good versus evil. Where Russell from World War I said, there's no God, there's no devil. This is how states behave. They're both doing it. Stop fighting, and tried to admonish both sides. At least he thought that way. And some people thought this was unfair and not recognizing some of the rights and wrongs. But that became a basis of criticism of him. And here's some quotations from the final statement that we talked about already. But again, he says, I'll quote something from the middle paragraph there. It is abundantly clear that the refugees have every right to the homeland from which they were driven, and the denial of this right is at the heart of the continuing conflict. So again, the fourth time he talks about it as a Palestinian homeland. Again, in the next sentence there. And the final paragraph is something he talked about before. We are frequently told that we must sympathize with Israel because of the suffering of the Jews in Europe at the hands of Nazis. I see in this no reason to perpetuate any suffering. Okay, so he does blame Israel more there for being aggressive, apparently more than their defensive needs would require, according to him. Okay, so I have a little PS here. What about a solution? He advocated a two-state solution, a state in Gaza. He talked about in letters to Jordan and Egypt. He talked about a few times. And so number 29 is something general he wrote in New Hopes for a Changing World. Separate the antagonists, separate the fighting parties. I know that Israelis and Palestinians, well, the race is not the best term there, but they're different religions. They're different ethnic groups. And he says, first separate them. So he believed in two states. But he had a utopian view looking to the future in number 30, where he's speaking generally. The only real solution is complete intermixture. That is intermarriage, racial mixture. But this was far in the future, and he calls this the human family, human brotherhood, which was utopian hope. And I remember when we had the Russell Society in Amherst, Mass., and we gave an award to Gideon Levy that Thom presented. Is that the right name? Thom Gideon Levy. He advocated a one-state solution, perhaps for reasons like this, that's really the more peaceful way to live together. but Russell wasn't the, this was a distant hope for Russell. Okay, thank you for listening. Questions?
Thank you all. Thank you, John. Tom, I was just searching for my unmute button there. Okay, I'll stop the recording now. That was excellent discussion of the issues. So I'm assuming we're going to have some questions. So let me open the floor immediately to would-be questioners. Can you unshare, John, please?